I was getting ready for another day at work, seated at the kitchen table with my coffee in one hand and the morning paper in the other. Emily was still in the bedroom, taking her time getting dressed. It was shaping up to be just another typical workday, like any other in the past year. As I flipped through the front page, a headline jumped out at me, exactly as Leo had hinted last night. He never failed to keep his promises. The article detailed the grim discovery of a man found dead in his garage. Michael Grayson, who worked at Calcas Realty Agency, had been brutally beaten and strangled. My wife, Emily, was also employed at Calcas Realty. At this point, the police had no leads, and the investigation was just beginning. I didn't bother reading any further. I folded the paper and left it where Emily usually sat. A sense of satisfaction washed over me as I thought about everything that had led to this moment. As I sipped my coffee, Emily walked into the room. She was breathtaking, a fact that always surprised me, even after 5 years of marriage. She looked even more radiant today than when we first crossed paths 7 years ago. We didn't exchange greetings as she poured herself a cup of coffee. It's astonishing how much our relationship has deteriorated in just 1 year. Our eyes met briefly, and I gave her a small nod and a weak smile. She ignored me, continuing the silent treatment she'd perfected over the last 2 months since our explosive argument about her late hours at work. She had become distant and icy, a complete turnaround from the warmth she showed during our early days together. I missed that connection deeply, but now it felt like our marriage was unraveling. Emily picked up the newspaper in one hand and her coffee in the other. Her eyes skimmed the headlines, and suddenly she spat out her coffee, her eyes locked on the story about Michael Gray's murder. "Oh God, no!" she gasped, looking like she might be sick as she bolted for the bathroom. I remained seated, silent, knowing there was no need for me to say anything to her about it. I took a deep breath, stood up, rinsed my coffee cup, and grabbed my briefcase. I headed out to the garage and got into my car, not even glancing in Emily's direction. Her feelings no longer concerned me. Let me tell you a bit about myself. My name is Tommy Donovan, but most folks call me TR. I'm 29, of Sicilian descent, and live in the Italian neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In my youth, I was always in some kind of trouble with a group of other Italian kids. We thought of ourselves as the junior mafia, but that's a story for another time. There's one incident that really changed my life's course. Leo Santoro and I were as close as brothers. We were the same age, ran with the same crowd, but there was a difference between us. Leo seemed to have a knack for getting caught. He wasn't dumb, but he couldn't steer clear of the law like I could. One night, Leo and I decided to break into a warehouse by the docks, looking to make a quick buck. The security guards must have spotted us entering through a side window, because they were waiting for us when we tried to sneak out with boxes of MP3 players. One guard grabbed Leo while another lunged at me. I shoved a box in his face and jumped onto the other guard, hitting him as hard as I could. As he let go of Leo, I yelled at him to run, and he took off, leaving me behind. The second guard recovered quickly and caught me. There wasn't much of a fight left in me after that. The guards worked me over pretty good until the cops arrived. When the police got there, they laughed with the guards as they looked me over, bruised and bloody. They took me to the station and threw me in a cell until my parents came to get me out. To make a long story short, I never gave up Leo's name. I ended up with 2 weeks in jail and probation. Leo called me several times to apologize for bailing, but I told him it was fine, since he'd have faced a much harsher sentence given his record. He swore he'd make it up to me, no matter how long it took. My parents were furious and humiliated by my arrest. My dad taught me a hard lesson with his leather belt, and then they shipped me off to St. Peter's Catholic High School to set me straight. The nuns and priests there did a fine job of knocking some sense into me. By my senior year, I had changed my ways. A priest who took me under his wing convinced me to pursue a different path, and I left the gang, eventually doing well enough to get into Penn State. I worked hard, earned my degree in human resources, and landed a good job with a reputable company. For the first time, my parents were truly proud of me. I dated a lot of women in college, but I wasn't looking for anything serious. That changed 3 years after graduation when I met Emily Marlowe. She made me rethink my bachelor lifestyle. We met at an HR seminar, and afterward, I got her number and promised to call her. She seemed pleased by that. Emily was different from anyone else I'd ever dated. She was full of surprises, a woman with a personality as complex as a puzzle. Sometimes she reminded me of the character Ryan Baxter plays in The Three Faces of Eve. The thing that really got under my skin about Emily was her stubborn streak. Once she got an idea in her head, there was no convincing her otherwise, even if she was dead wrong. Our relationship had its ups and downs, with moments of closeness followed by times of distance. We had agreed to hold off on any physical intimacy. Within the first year of dating, I learned that Emily had been abandoned as a baby. Her mother left her on a church pew and disappeared, which led to her growing up in orphanages and foster homes. I always thought that missing out on a mother's love and care in those early years left a mark on her personality. Despite her struggles, Emily was the most loving and kind-hearted person I had ever met. In those early days, my parents weren't thrilled about my relationship with Emily. They kept warning me not to get too involved, but I chose to ignore their advice. Emily and I tied the knot in a small ceremony at our local church. We both agreed to hold off on starting a family until we were financially stable and Emily could stay home as a full-time mom. My parents weren't happy with that decision either. Problems started creeping into our marriage during the third year when Emily's company got bought out by a bigger firm, and she lost her job. She was really down about it because she loved that job. Even though we weren't struggling financially, it took a while for Emily to find another position, which turned out to be an office manager role at Calcas Realty Agency. She wasn't thrilled about it. I tried to be there for her while she was unemployed, but sometimes it felt like she resented me for having a job I enjoyed, while she had to settle for something less. Her mood swings were intense, especially during her time of the month. After a few months at Calcas, she gradually found her old self again. Things improved between us, even in the bedroom, where things had been strained during her unemployment. There were times in bed when I could tell she was trying hard to make up for the rough patch by being more assertive in our lovemaking. For about 9 months, I didn't have any complaints, and our marriage thrived. Emily started taking a home study course in real estate, and I was thrilled to see her so enthusiastic about her work and our life together. Then, as life would have it, came both good and bad news. The good news was that I was steadily climbing the management ladder at my company. After 5 years, my future looked bright. But a merger with an Atlanta-based company meant big changes in my job responsibilities. I had to integrate their staff into our corporate structure, which meant training their personnel and making some tough calls about staff reductions. I was excited about the new challenges, but the downside was the increased travel and being away from home more often. Emily didn't like the idea of me being on the road so much, even though I made sure to be home on weekends during longer trips. At first, she seemed to accept it, but eventually things got complicated. My weekend visits home weren't enough to make up for all the time I spent away. Emily became stubborn, accusing me of enjoying my trips and even suggesting I might have a lover in Atlanta. I tried my best, calling her during the day, sending flowers and funny cards, but her coldness didn't waver. After nearly 6 months, I finished the staff training in Atlanta, and my traveling days were over. I got a promotion at corporate headquarters and thought these changes would make Emily see me in a better light. But I was wrong. Once my travels ended, Emily started putting in more hours at the agency. When I asked her about it, she sarcastically said it was her turn to chase a promotion and hinted it was time for me to get used to spending evenings alone. Our closeness took a hit. 2 weeks ago, Emily told me she'd be away for the weekend with her colleagues, attending a developer's session for high-rise condos near the riverfront. She said it was essential for her career without even checking with me first, leaving no room for discussion. Even though I had left the junior mafia behind in high school, I stayed close with some of my best buddies, especially Leo. I called him up and asked if he wanted to catch the Steelers versus Raiders game on Sunday. He jumped at the chance and knew how to get the best seats for Steelers games. I mentioned Emily's business trip, and Leo suggested I spend the weekend with him and the guys, catching up on all the neighborhood gossip. A weekend away sounded perfect, so I didn't bother telling Emily about my plans. Friday morning was crisp, and as we had breakfast, I casually asked Emily how I could reach her while she was gone. Emily dismissed the idea with a chilly wave of her hand, insisting she'd be surrounded by important people and didn't want any interruptions. It was like she saw me as some nagging parent instead of her husband. I let it slide, and later that day, Emily took off for Atlantic City. Seeing Leo again felt like a real reunion. It had been over a year since we last hung out. I was one of the few who managed to leave our old neighborhood without ending up behind bars. Leo brought up the debt he owed me, promising to be there whenever I needed help. Saturday night, we headed to the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge on the southeast side, a strip joint reminiscent of the Bada Bing Club from The Sopranos. The place was bustling with scantily clad dancers, just like in the show. A young woman, barely older than 18, came over and started dancing provocatively in front of me. Leo nudged me, hinting that she was available for the night, implying she could be mine if I wanted. While Leo made some inappropriate advances, I stuck to my principles. I told him I was committed to my marriage vows. Sure, I was tempted, but I believed in loyalty and fidelity. I turned down the dancer's advances, and she quickly moved on to another interested guy. Leo shook his head in disbelief, saying I seemed really serious about the whole fidelity thing. I just nodded, telling him that without fidelity, there was nothing left. No love, no marriage. The next morning, Pittsburgh greeted us with its usual cold, windy weather, but that didn't stop the swarm of fans heading to Three Rivers Stadium for the Steelers versus Raiders game. The rivalry between these two teams was intense, almost like gang warfare, ever since the Steelers snatched victory from the Raiders in one of the NFL's most memorable plays. With a lucky bounce, Victor Ramirez made an incredible catch that changed the outcome of a tough defensive battle, marking Pittsburgh's first ever playoff win at Three Rivers Stadium. The legacy of that game lingered. It's a good thing weapons are not permitted on the playing field. The Steelers weren't having a great year, with a record of 5 wins and 5 losses. Today was the biggest game of the season, with the silver and black back in town. It was a hard-hitting afternoon of football. I was losing my voice from all the yelling and cheering, but the final score was Steelers 21, Raiders 20. I thought the day couldn't have ended better. Despite Leo's invitation to celebrate, I had to decline and promised we'd catch up another time. I had a tough day at the office ahead and didn't need a hangover adding to my stress. Plus, Emily was supposed to be coming home that evening, and I wanted to be there when she returned. However, Emily didn't come home Sunday night. I left for work Monday morning with a heavy heart, filled with doubts about our marriage. There was this sense of impending doom whenever I thought about the state of things between Emily and me. Sure, all marriages hit rough patches, but maybe ours had decayed into something far worse. The workday was as busy as I expected, starting with high-level meetings and dealing with a lawsuit against the company. It wasn't until 5:30 that I finally had a chance to check my emails. There were dozens of messages from the staff, along with updates on the lawsuit. Near the end of the list, I spotted one with the subject line, "Who was the last one to know?" I opened it, expecting a funny cartoon, but instead I was confronted with a photo of Emily kissing another man passionately. Below the photo, there was a message asking, "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." A cold chill ran up my spine as I stared at the picture of Emily locked in a kiss with someone else. Despite the shock, I clicked on the next link. Another image popped up, this time showing Emily and the same man, both naked, standing in a motel room. Again, there was a message asking, "Want to know what happened after this?" My hand trembled and a tightness gripped my throat and chest as the image of my unclothed wife seared into my mind. Part of me didn't want to see the next photo, but I knew I had to click the link. The final image was the nail in the coffin of my marriage. There was Emily on the bed, on all fours, with the same man from the previous photos. Her face was a mask of lust and ecstasy. The woman I had loved so deeply turned out to be an unfaithful adulteress. I'd given her all my love and trust, and now she was tearing my heart apart. The text at the bottom of the photo read, "Prick provided by Michael Grayson." My worst nightmare had just been shoved in my face. Emily's recent coldness was more than just a wife upset with her husband. It felt like the rigor mortis of our marriage setting in. What came next for me was a mix of anger and a strange, calm determination. I hadn't felt that kind of resolve in a long time. Revenge began to settle into my thoughts because I couldn't let infidelity and betrayal stand. 2 people would pay dearly for knowingly insulting me. My first thoughts were about the person who sent me those damning emails. There was no name or clue about the sender's identity. Questions filled my mind. Why send this email? What did they hope to achieve by exposing Emily's infidelity? Were they friends or foes of Emily? These questions would have to wait. I popped a CD into my computer, saved the email and photos, and then deleted everything. A scrubber program erased all traces from my hard drive. Sitting back in my swivel chair, trying to make sense of Emily's betrayal, I could only chalk it up to her fractured personality. If she wanted a divorce, I would have granted it, and we could have walked away from the wreck of our marriage. But now, my revenge would be swift and complete. There would be no mercy for either of them. The plan began to take shape in my mind. After leaving the office, I found a payphone around the corner. Using an untraceable pay-as-you-go cell phone, I called Leo and told him I thought it was time for me to collect on the debt he owed me. When I got home around 7:30, Emily was already there watching TV. She didn't bother to greet me but commented on how late I was getting in. I shot back that she'd been coming home late herself, then headed for the kitchen. The silence between us was thick. I grabbed a beer and went to my office, making sure to lock the door behind me. In our justice system, a person convicted of a capital crime usually faces one of two sentences: the death penalty or life in prison. My plan for revenge included one death sentence and one life sentence. I needed some quiet time to fine-tune my plan. Leo would handle Mr. Michael Gray, and I'd take care of Emily. To make it look like a simple case of a wife leaving her husband, I sent flowers to Emily's office and made dinner reservations near her workplace. I left messages asking her to meet me, but she never showed up. I made sure the maitre d' knew my wife stood me up, telling him to give our table to someone else. Emily came home that night without offering any excuse or explanation for missing our dinner date. Honestly, I wasn't interested in hearing anything she might have said in her defense. The die was cast, and the wheels of revenge were already turning. The next day, a courier delivered an envelope to my office marked personal and confidential. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a bold heading, instructing me to destroy it after reading. The first sentence advised me to secure an airtight alibi for the upcoming night. The second sentence gave me a name, Javier Morales, and a phone number. I read and reread the number until I memorized it, then shredded the paper and scattered the pieces in various trash cans outside the office building that evening. I got home before Emily, changed clothes, poured myself a tall Jim Beam, and settled in to listen to some smooth jazz. The TV stayed off. This was my night to be the king of my castle, and Emily had to find her own entertainment. When she got home, there was no confrontation. She took one look at the scene, turned around, and left again. I didn't care where she went, whether she was out to eat or meeting Michael Grayson. The sand in the hourglass was almost gone for both of them. I was in bed by the time Emily finally returned, slipping quietly in beside me. Silence was the loudest noise before I drifted off to sleep. Thursday nights were poker nights for some guys from work, held in the back room of the old Stagecoach bar. This was my airtight alibi for the evening. This time, I was the one slipping into bed early in the morning. The clock on my nightstand read 2:35 as I pulled the covers over me, without a sound or movement from Emily. Falling asleep wasn't hard, even knowing what had happened earlier that night. Now that Michael Grayson had met his end, it was time to deal with the second culprit. The life sentence for Emily didn't need to be immediate. After making a phone call, I felt a sense of satisfaction and justice. Whatever it was in Emily's twisted personality that led her to disrespect me so blatantly was for someone else to figure out. I no longer felt any sympathy for the woman I once loved with all my heart and soul. She brought this retribution upon herself. The police interviewed everyone at Calcas Realty Agency, collecting interesting but inconsistent statements. Emily faced several interviews with the police. Detective Henry Lawson questioned me about Michael Grayson, trying to insinuate a more than professional relationship between Michael and Emily. I expressed complete faith in my wife's fidelity, dismissing any doubts. He just gave me a knowing smile, perhaps feeling sorry for me as the poor, betrayed husband. Michael Grayson's funeral was held on Tuesday. That morning I watched Emily slip into her somber black dress, the same one she wore to my mother's funeral. She didn't ask if I wanted to join her at Michael's service. Whatever thoughts she had about Michael's passing, she kept them to herself. I was sure she had plenty to think about, including the murder and her own infidelity. Over the next week, Emily seemed eager to have a serious talk about our relationship, but I gave her the cold shoulder, shutting down her attempts. I had moved past any hope of reconciliation. I held all the cards and could end the charade whenever I wanted. 3 weeks after Michael's murder, the police investigation seemed to lose steam. There were no new leads, and rumors suggested Michael might have been killed by a loan shark or a bookie. During this time, Emily's mental state continued to deteriorate. She became more absent-minded and confused. Little things startled her, but I offered no help or comfort. Even as I watched her struggle, I thought, too bad, as I saw her slowly unravel. Finally, on the following Thursday, I made the call to Javier. The plan was set, and he was ready to put it into action. Emily had only hours left before her new life would begin. Friday morning, I left for work before Emily got dressed, deliberately avoiding a final encounter at home. The sand in the hourglass had run out. Across the street from our house, a car with two men waited. The kidnapping happened at a four-way stop intersection, with cars in front of and behind Emily's vehicle, blocking any escape. Like a well-rehearsed operation, two men moved quickly. As the driver's door opened, a needle punctured her arm while the seatbelt was cut. Emily was shoved into the passenger seat, and one of the men took the wheel. The three cars drove off swiftly, the whole event taking less than 30 seconds. There were no witnesses. At 11 o'clock that morning, at a bank branch on the east side of town, a woman who looked exactly like Emily walked in and handed a teller a withdrawal slip for $25,000 from our joint account. She presented a driver's license and passport as ID. The teller took a few minutes to prepare a cashier's check. A guard escorted her to her car, noting the license plate as she drove away. The line at the American Airlines ticket counter was short. The Emily lookalike approached, showed her photo ID and passport, and received a boarding pass. The flight had been booked online the night before. The first leg was to JFK Airport, then a non-stop flight on flight number 951 to Rio de Janeiro. The Pittsburgh departure was at 4:45 p.m., landing at JFK in New York. Later, at 10:30 p.m., the American Airlines plane took off, carrying Emily Donovan on an overnight flight to Brazil. I waited until noon on Saturday before contacting the police to report Emily missing. To my surprise, Detective Henry Lawson was the officer who came to take the report. I told him Emily hadn't returned home at her usual time. Attempts to call her cell went unanswered, with a message saying the number was out of service. When I called Natalie Pierce, one of Emily's close friends at Calcas Realty, she said Emily hadn't shown up for work the day before and hadn't called in sick. Detective Lawson took cryptic notes, occasionally glancing up at me. Eventually, he started asking about the state of my marriage, probing for any issues that might be connected to Emily's disappearance. I repeated what I had told him during the investigation into Michael Grayson's murder. Our marriage was fine, and I couldn't imagine why Emily would just disappear. He then asked if I had anything to do with Emily's disappearance, to which I emphatically replied that I loved my wife and couldn't harm her. Lying to the police was a skill I had honed early in life, hanging out with the junior mafia, and it still served me well. 3 days later, Detective Lawson visited my office during business hours, probably to get a better read on the husband he was dealing with. Once in my office, he sat down with a tight-lipped smile. I wore the look of a worried husband, asking if there was any news about Emily. He told me they had retraced Emily's steps after she left the house on Friday morning, offering some mixed news. Several witnesses reported seeing her having coffee at Denny's on Bennett Street around 10 a.m. on Friday. Detective Lawson informed me that Emily had appeared at Allegheny National Bank around 11 a.m., as seen on surveillance video. She made a $25,000 withdrawal from our joint savings account. I feigned disbelief, asking how that was possible since Emily hadn't mentioned needing to withdraw money. Detective Lawson assured me the facts were clear, explaining that the bank teller had made copies of Emily's driver's license and passport before issuing the cashier's check. He was confident that once I saw the surveillance footage, I'd recognize the person at the teller's window as my wife, Emily. Detective Lawson paused again, watching to see how I'd react to this revelation. I told him there had to be some mistake, emphasizing that Emily and I shared everything about our lives. I maintained a bewildered look as I stared back at him, aware that he was holding back the most devastating news and that I'd need to put on another performance. The detective continued with the most shocking part, revealing that Emily had purchased airline tickets to New York and then on to Rio de Janeiro. He mentioned that they'd found her car in the long-term parking lot at the airport, and her flight had left Pittsburgh on Friday afternoon at 4:45, with the flight to Rio departing New York at 10:30. The detective said they'd contacted the Rio de Janeiro police to find Emily, but she seemed to have vanished once she arrived in Rio. Detective Lawson now stared intently at me, waiting for my response. I exclaimed that it was madness, insisting that Emily would never do such a thing. I stressed my belief in her love for me and mine for her, declaring that leaving the country was absurd. To portray the betrayed husband, I began to cry right in front of him. There was a moment of silence in my office before the detective spoke again. He asked if I thought this could be connected to Michael Grayson's murder. I responded by questioning how he could even suggest that, asserting that my wife had no involvement in the murder, and reminding him that she'd been interviewed and never charged in the case. The detective clarified that while she hadn't been charged, she was high on their suspect list. I reacted to the detective's statement about others suggesting Emily and Michael Gray were romantically involved. Expressing disbelief, I called it absurd to link her to Gray's murder, saying that office gossip wasn't enough to make such claims. My eyes bore into his as I challenged the credibility of the accusations. The detective explained they were still investigating, and with Emily now out of the country, suspicions about her role in the murder had intensified. He paused for a moment before sharing that evidence at the crime scene indicated a carnal motive, with Gray tortured for hours before being strangled. I let out a small laugh, dismissing the idea that my petite wife could have committed such a crime. I questioned whether the detective truly believed she was capable of such violence, pointing out she could barely open a pickle jar, let alone strangle someone. I expressed frustration with the growing and seemingly baseless accusations. I told Detective Lawson that although all evidence pointed to my wife's involvement, he suggested she might have had help. Surprised, I questioned if I was being considered as her accomplice before he could say more. He explained they'd considered the possibility, but assured me I had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, though his voice lacked conviction. I summarized the situation, expressing disbelief that they thought Emily had fled the country because of her involvement in a murder and that I was a likely suspect in aiding her. I paused to glare directly at him, seeking clarification, and asked if I had accurately summarized his statements. He sat there, trying to determine if my indignation was genuine. With a hint of scorn in my voice, I informed the detective that if there was nothing else, our meeting was over. Rising from my desk, I opened the door, signaling his departure. Detective Lawson stood up and slowly walked to the door. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Donovan. I'll keep you updated on your wife's disappearance," he said. He didn't extend his hand and I didn't offer mine. After he left, I closed the door and settled back into my swivel chair. I was sure Detective Lawson's visit aimed to gather more information from me than to provide substantial details about the two cases. I carefully considered each statement and question, knowing he suspected my involvement. Yet my alibis were airtight. I was playing poker the night Michael Gray was murdered, and I was in meetings all day the Friday Emily disappeared. It was Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Emily vanished. I hadn't heard from Javier or Leo, and Emily's whereabouts remained unknown. Sometimes I felt like I was being followed, whether during my morning commute or evening return home. My actions were meticulously planned, sticking to routine, with grocery shopping on the way. Nothing suggested evasion or concealment. Every other day, I called Detective Lawson for updates on Emily, but he had no new information. The Brazilian police found no evidence of Emily after her arrival in Rio. Later that afternoon, I ordered a pizza from Domino's. As I watched college football on TV, the doorbell rang, and the pizza delivery guy arrived with my hot pizza. I handed the delivery guy some cash along with a couple of bucks as a tip. When I opened the pizza box in the kitchen, I noticed an envelope resting on top. Inside was a note with instructions for the next day. It told me to dress appropriately for church and attend the 10 o'clock Mass at St. Peter's. The note instructed me to slip out the east side door during communion, where a dark Ford Crown Victoria would be waiting. As I read the note, I realized this would be my final meeting with Emily before Javier arranged for her departure. He'd waited 2 weeks to make sure the well-documented cover story of Emily flying out of the country was the only evidence the police had. Javier had carefully crafted an elaborate deception to mislead the investigation, establishing that Emily was alive when she supposedly boarded the plane to Rio. This prevented the authorities from building any case against me, even though there was no body to be found. As I lay in bed, the room was completely dark, my mind replaying the last month and a half, which had been a waking nightmare since receiving that email. The sequence of events reminded me that my heritage had a way of bringing out the darker side of my personality. I knew exactly where my darkness stemmed from whenever I felt disrespected, whether by nature or upbringing. St. Peter's is a large church, and the 10 o'clock Mass draws several hundred people. It was easy to blend into the crowd and watch for anyone tailing me. If the police were on my trail, they had to wait outside as the congregation moved forward for communion. I quietly slipped out the side door. The dark Ford sedan was waiting with the engine running, and I got into the back seat as it roared away into the busy street. The ride took about 10 minutes before we stopped in front of a large warehouse. The driver didn't turn around, simply telling me to enter the building through the side door. Inside the empty warehouse, there was a small office area at the back with light streaming from several windows. As I approached, Javier stepped out and walked toward me, marking our first face-to-face meeting. Javier greeted me, mentioning that Leo had said it was okay to call me TR. We shook hands, and with a stoic expression, Javier warned me that Emily's condition had changed, hinting that seeing her might be upsetting. I told him I no longer cared about her appearance or what she'd been through since they took her, then walked toward the open door. Stopping at the door, I asked if she was on any medications now. Javier replied that she wasn't, but admitted she probably wished she were. He claimed to have kept her clean and fully conscious, asserting that she was now a broken woman and well prepared for her new life. We both entered a well-lit room where Emily was tied to a chair in the center. I circled her and stood directly in front. Despite being inches away, she remained silent, her gaze fixed beyond my shoulder, with none of the sparkle and vitality in her eyes. I told Emily that for the rest of her life, she'd remember bringing this misery upon herself. I recounted enduring her mood swings and cold demeanor, emphasizing that her infidelity and the disrespect she and her lover showed were intolerable. I made it clear she'd spend the rest of her life paying for her betrayal, noting that Michael had already paid his debt to me. Speaking slowly, I wanted her to understand it was me who had brought her and her lover to justice. Despite once loving her, I now felt nothing but loathing toward her. I informed her that Javier assured me she'd be well cared for wherever she was sent, as well as they treat their best horses and cattle. I lingered for a moment longer, noticing a tear forming in Emily's eye. It was the only acknowledgement I received before turning and walking out. The Ford sedan returned me to St. Peter's, where I slipped inside. As the 11 o'clock Mass ended, I left the church and drove straight home. A hard knot inside my gut needed drowning with some Jim Beam. It's been 3 years since I last saw Emily. I've almost erased her from my life, with no traces of her remaining. I sold the house we shared after she disappeared. The cases handled by Detectives Lawson and Doc are now buried in the cold case files. I spend more time with Leo at the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge and have enjoyed the company of that young stripper on several occasions. Marriage is off the table. My 5 years with Emily convinced me that marriage is more trouble than it's worth. My parents were right to warn me about getting involved with Emily. Kids should listen to their parents' advice, though they rarely do. Later, I found out Natalie Pierce sent me the email. She had been Michael Gray's lover before he left her for Emily. I never thanked her for the email, nor did I ever find out how she obtained those photos of Michael and Emily. I guess she got her revenge the same time I did. There's truth in the saying about a woman scorned.